Even though this was an animation, I got to tell you, to get a chance just a couple months ago to interact with the actual hardware, drive it literally onto the show floor. I've seen it in operation out in the field. I mean, it's just very exciting that this lunar hardware is really being built, right now. We're in a very exciting time. For the next panel, introduce the next panel. Explorers by definition aim to reach some of the most difficult places that exist. And space represents sort of the ultimate engineering challenge. And so joining me are two folks really at the forefront of extreme engineering for environments beyond the Earth. So I'd first like to invite up here to join me Britney Schmidt. She is with NASA and the Cornell University. She's working on the Europa Clipper project, among others. She also has done tons of interesting work in Antarctica, which is one of the things I want to talk to her about. Antarctica is one of my favorite places on the planet. But also, please join me, Jason Hatton. Jason, if you'll come join us. He's with ESA. He is the science coordinator for the International Space Station, has done some amazing work on some of the challenges in biology, human physiology, and other forms of biology, and the challenges it faces in space, and especially associated with microgravity, something I was particularly interested in as well. So thank you both for joining me up here today. So first, why don't we let you both sort of tell us about yourselves, and with especially attuned to what project you're working on right now. I mean, I've got a million questions I want to ask you guys, but fill in the gap and what I might have missed here in the intro.
Sure. So I'm Britney Schmidt. I'm a professor at Cornell University, and my group works on essentially trying to put the foundation together for eventually getting through one of these ice shells on the moons of Jupiter or Saturn. It's a very long process to get there, and so we're trying to do the pieces on Earth now that'll teach us how to explore when we get there, and building the foundation for some key parts of that technology that may enable a different way of thinking about that problem.
Mm-hmm. And Jason?
Yeah, so I'm, as Richard said, I previously actually coordinated the biology science activities in human spaceflight at ESA. What I'm working on now is actually essentially building the future programs. And indeed, Paul's presentation before, I think, fits very well with changing dreams into reality. So, in 2014, we defined a strategy for an exploration strategy for ESA, with Europeans exploring low Earth orbit, Moon, and Mars. We're well on our way to implementing that. We're continuing to operate on the ISS. We have significant contributions to Artemis with the European Service Module, the Gateway. We're also developing a new lander. But now looking forward to the next 20 years, beyond the Moon, there is Mars. And so, indeed, we now need to start building, the technology and the capabilities to do that. So that's, I have sort of both perspectives I have from working as a scientist and working on experiments and trying to do those on Space Shuttle and ISS, and then to actually turn, the program into a vision, a dream, into reality in individual steps of that. So yeah.
Well, why don't we, let's say, since we just had Paul up and he was talking about the storytelling aspect.
Yes. Yeah.
And you and I were talking before coming up here also about 20-year projects take 20 years. Mm-hmm. That's like a career if you're lucky to be young enough when you start it. And so outside of the inspiration aspects of storytelling, planning it out when you have the complexity of not only the European consortium, but the international consortium is non-trivial. Can you give us a little insight as to how do you put those building blocks together?
Yes, exactly, because actually when I started my career, I said I wouldn't work in strategy because strategy was always planning things which were not going to happen because something else would happen in between. So in fact, the way we have our strategy, we have the vision remains, the dream remains. So, the horizon goal for our program is Europeans participating in a first human mission to Mars. But there's many options you have on that. So you break it down into options where you can make choices. Depending on how the conditions change, you need it, so it needs to be achievable. That's the key thing. You need engagement with your stakeholders. You need, and that needs to be part of the narrative. You need results in the meantime as well. So for going to Mars, there's many technical challenges for a human to go from a 3-year flight. If you're in microgravity the whole time, will you come back, essentially a bag of jelly? So all of those challenges. So you can break that down into steps, and then you have decision points. Our program actually works in 3-year cycles, so that gives very, very clear decision points to do that. So that's essentially the way we work. And so if we look at the last 10 years of our program, we've sometimes changed direction to achieve the same goal, but through a different route. And so we have that's the way you have resilience in the program, I think.
And Britney, obviously, we were talking at the rooftop, I think, last night about the incredible challenges of not only landing something on a moon of Jupiter, but tunneling through what I learned from our discussion is something like 10 kilometers of ice, which is far beyond what I think we've ever done on Earth, even when we can hang out with the hardware. And so that is a pretty audacious goal. I know you've been spending some time in Antarctica. We were talking about that too. So tell us a little bit about these first steps. So we know you have to plan 20-year incremental steps. Tell us about some of the first steps of trying to get down through ice to do research.
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly, we're looking at this planet. So I think a lot about Europa. So it's the innermost icy moon of Jupiter. It's about the size of the Earth's moon and has about 100 or so kilometers of ice plus water on the outside. The first step is trying to figure out how deep the ice is, if you were trying to think about it as an object between you and the ocean. What we're trying to do is to think about all of the science that you could do also on the path down into the ocean. But on Earth, we have up to about 5 kilometers of ice, right? So we're never going to get a chance to take something through 30 kilometers of ice before we actually go do it in space. So the other way I like to think about it is that, we drove cars on Earth for like 100 years before we sent one to Mars, right? So you've got a 100-year time frame or something like that. We're trying to actually shorten that. So by going to Antarctica, it's the most ice we have. It is also a kind of a social imperative to be able to treat our planet better and to understand what's happening to it. And so it gives us an opportunity to kind of double dip, to develop for space, but to do something good for our planet. And so there, what we're doing right now, our team works a lot with teams that do what's called hot water drilling, which is basically a really fancy fire hose, taking melted snow, warming it up, and using that to actually drill and access the ice. And so where we've been, we've gone up through up to about 750 meters of ice, right? So we're getting onto the kilometer scale, which is a lot. But it's thinking about all the complexities of the process, going through the ice, getting out, navigating under the ice, and then thinking about how you can reimagine what you would do with that science if you went to a place for the first time, right? Here, we can measure the ocean chemistry. We know it very well, so very, very small changes mean a lot. And so we can map those things here. Well, then you have to think about how do you get to that point by the time you hit the ocean. So we're trying to think about things you can do like melt through the ice and pull samples in as you're going through the ice shell to be able to understand all of that when you get to the ocean. And a weird way that we like to think about it, you imagine the first mission to an alien ocean, right? Melting through an ice shell, and people envision like a vehicle driving around and looking at the seafloor. It's probably not going to be that. But how can we do the same science with something that avoids some of the risk, actually? So one of the things that we're trying to work on is just these very small changes from what the assumed process will be to what we can actually do. And those little changes mean a lot. And so it's things like just taking your vehicle all the way down to the ocean and looking, just with a camera, for example, isn't really enough. That's not the science we're looking to do. But if we can understand the chemistry on the way down, if we can profile this like upper part of the ocean, then we learn infinitely more about the chemistry, about how the global ocean actually works on this planet. And so we're trying to think about teaching ourselves how to explore in kind of a different way. So that's what we do in Antarctica.
One of the things I really liked about the discussion we had yesterday on the rooftop was that profiling all the way down and realizing that the chemistry you find throughout that journey will tell you about the evolution of that whole planet and the probable potentials of what you will find underneath, even if you don't find it on the first go.
Exactly. The geochemistry, even in the ice shell, right? It's actually it's a terrible place. Like none of us would want to actually live in an ice shell, but there's perfectly happy microbes, right? There's perfectly happy organisms, and they actually engineer their environment a little bit, right? They emit these proteins that keep channels in the ice open and allow them to continue to live there. So those are places that we want to obviously explore. But as you go down, the ice actually has a little bit of a fingerprint, right? So a little bit of the salt, a little bit of the material that came from the ocean that it was formed from is actually there in the ice for you to sample. So it may be an opportunity for us to really understand the ocean before we even get there.
And Jason, if you don't mind, I want to ask you a little further back in your career question. I really want to, a question that I want to talk about is biology, because we've, earlier in our other panels, we already talked about some of the physiological challenges to living in space. And one of the things I found fascinating when I was preparing for my own space flight is just how even outside of the radiation, outside of the lack of an atmosphere, outside of all these challenges, even microgravity is challenging in a way that at least I would not have previously presumed. And my simple understanding, and please correct and go beyond, is that even the organelles on the inside of a single cell that you would think are floating neutrally buoyant within the gel on the inside of a cell, the vector of gravity is actually really important even for fundamental cellular functions. And so I believe you've been involved in experiments to go from microgravity to full gravity and maybe even beyond to test some of these challenges.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm actually a cell biologist by training and worked on immunology experiments. And one of the physiological effects of spaceflight is immune suppression. So there's many factors for the human being which can influence that. There's a confinement, there's a stress. But also when you start looking at isolated immune cells, you see actually a similar immune suppression. So is there some effect which is occurring at the cellular level? So we did a whole series of experiments, and one of the nice things that we had with our program, and of course this was done on shuttle, that was, I did a number of experiments during my PhD which were flown on shuttle, and then when we had station, we continued those, so there was quite a nice continuity, and what we saw was actually very similar effects on the cells. So you start to ask, what are the mechanisms? And in fact, the cells are not bags of jelly. They have what's known as a cytoskeleton. This is a very dynamic structure. So the thought is that this is itself perhaps sensitive, and so the architecture of the cell is affected, the signaling is affected, and that can impact the cellular function. The problem is making the connection between what you observe in vitro, essentially in a test tube, and what you observe in the crew, because the in vitro situation is an artificial situation. So the way we're moving forward now is actually to have sort of the next phase of that research is to have sort of tissue constructs, so to simulate what is occurring in the tissue, which gives you then maybe something which is more translatable. But we saw tremendous changes, suppressed immune function, disorganized cytoskeleton, and one of the experiments we did, which gave us a very interesting answer, which was 42. Was we actually looked at how macrophages, which are one of the primary lines of defense in the immune system. It's the most primitive part of the immune system. If you have a bacteria which enters into your bloodstream, the first thing that goes onto that is a macrophage, and it eats it up, and then it presents it to other cells, which then make a stronger response. And so we were able to study that in real time with a chemiluminescence assay of the function of how they were attacking not a bacteria but something simulating a bacteria, and changing the gravity level. And what we saw was the cells were very sensitive to that change in the gravity level, and the time of reaction was about 42 seconds, which I thought was quite interesting with Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So yes,
and as we, not only of course when you get to Europa, you're going to be looking for potentials, not only signs of life, but signs of chemistry that might be a precursor to life. But let's go from that micro back now again into our extreme engineering. There's I think a lot of us, one of my favorite space films of recent was the 7 Minutes of Terror, showing just how hard it is to land something on Mars. That it's that remote and that many things to go on. And you, of course, you haven't even drilled a full kilometer yet. And you're going to put something not only on another planet, but on a moon of another planet, that's going to take an amazing, complex array of things to get there, which is a stack of engineering challenges. But you were mentioning to me the other day about the things that cause failure are not always the things that all of us might think where the failures come from. So talk about operating in this icy environment and where the more probable failures seem to come from.
Yeah, I'm basically mentioning that you think through 90% of the problems that you're going to run into, and it's the last 10 that'll get you. One of the biggest challenges is actually not baking yourself. As a spacecraft or as an ice robot is actually the ability to get the heat that your own systems are producing, the ability to get that out is actually an incredible challenge. So you're spending time in this environment that's minus 35, that would seem to be the issue, but it actually is sometimes getting the heat out of the system. Luckily, when we go to a place like Europa, drilling for kilometers with an actually active drill is very hard, right? You have drills that'll get softer, the materials get softer over time or get more dull, but we're lucky that we get to use heat, right? Ice is just going to melt. So the idea is that you kind of burrow into the surface and then let heat kind of take over. One of the odd challenges is that you, somewhere in the middle of the ice shelf, could potentially become buoyant. So then it becomes hard to go down, right? So you're building your own melt pocket as you go down. How do you keep the vehicle actually going down? So one of the challenges might be designing the first ever flooded spacecraft, right? Where you have to bring in the environment from around you to actually make it possible for you to continue to descend. Mm-hmm. So those are the types of things that we're thinking about, right? You're used to building monoliths to keep the environment out. But in fact, we want the environment in to study it, but it may also be the engineering challenge of being able to get all the way to the ocean, as pressure's changing and things like that. So we think a lot about that in terms of potential failures. The other one that I think is really interesting that we were talking about is that some of the worst environments might actually, for being alive, might actually be the best ones to explore for preservation of a record of life. So we're talking a little bit, so inside this giant ice shell, we might expect that things are freezing and concentrating over time. So you melt and freeze and melt and freeze. That can cause acids to build up and can cause these incredibly low, what we call low water activity, meaning you still have a fluid, but you can't do anything with the water that's actually in that fluid. It's a terrible place to be alive, but it's incredibly good at preserving a record of it. So if your spacecraft can deal with it, it might actually be the best place to go because it's like a salt flat. It's like a concentrated record of what's happened in that ice shell. So we try to think about the ways in which the really extreme places actually might be giving us something to do. But you mentioned the challenge of landing there. That's in fact, on October 10th, we're launching Europa Clipper, which is a NASA mission, and it'll be joined in the Jupiter system by the JUICE mission, which is ESA's mission. So on October 10th, we're going to launch a spacecraft finally to Europa. It's going to orbit Jupiter, but it's going to do for the first time enough imaging that we can actually see the surface at the resolution we'd need to be able to plan. Because if you back to the 7 minutes of terror, most of Mars is pretty flat. None of Europa is flat. Imagine a crevasse field that you've seen and you want to avoid as you're going up a glacier. That's the whole surface, right? We're going to have to really figure out how to land in a new environment. And so the very first step is to get enough information that we can then do that. But then the rest of the problem is at least partially solved and partially done on this planet. So fingers crossed, I think we can get there.
Yeah, and let's also mention, too, you mentioned Mars as a possible destination also for not just robots, but ultimately humans. And, if we're going to do something that extreme, and it takes so long to get there and so long to get home, you want to make sure you can hang out for more than 48 hours. That means, in my mind's eye, I'll probably miss a couple, but, you need to probably mine water. You got to make that into fuel and oxygen. You got to probably have a greenhouse to provide food. You got to have a radiation hardened and pressurized place to live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So from a mission planning standpoint and a technical engineering standpoint, I want to just kind of mention how big this scale of problem is.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that is the most delicate part of a human mission to Mars is the crew, of course. And so what we need to do is we need to do de-risking of what is needed for going to Mars, for the crew to operate it. But really the round trip, I mean, the round trip in itself is 3 years. So that's something where in our program we're looking at the effort which will go into de-risking that, of how can you support the crew, the psychological, even the architecture of where they will spend 3 years. You know, you need to think about that. The options that you have a lot of trade-offs of medical support. They will have to work autonomously, so crew, not just emergency medical support, but routine medical support. So those are all options that we need to start studying now. We need to do that on the ground in analog environments. But then also we have the continuum, we have low Earth orbit, which of course ISS, there's a lot of work being done with this. The Gateway also, and Artemis gives also a simulation environment to test. In principle, you could do a mission simulating perhaps at least part of the duration of a mission to Mars around the Gateway and then to the lunar surface. So you need to build this up block by block. So those are some of the challenges we're looking into. And the first thing is making sure you've thought of all the things that you need to look into. And so that's really at the outset. And then looking at different options and ways of trading that off. And there's not one way of doing that. That there's maybe multiple ways, and perhaps you need multiple ways of supporting the crew if something goes wrong.
Yeah, well, I've got one final question then for each of you. It's short with a short answer, which is, if you had to guess, what year or decade do you think that will put an object down on an icy moon? Do you have one for that?
Yeah, it depends on which Congress we have, but I think this is a 50-year problem. It could be shorter. So.
Decades. So numerous decades.
Probably 2 at least.
Okay.
Unfortunately, how it goes.
And for you, obviously, we've heard from the Artemis folks going to the moon is for the next target, at least as a consortium. I'm a big pro-Mars guy myself. What is your personal prediction, or ESA's prediction, if you prefer, about when you think we'll put a human down on Mars?
Well, it would be my personal prediction. For me, Mars has always been 20 years in the future, and it moves a year later every year. But I think we're getting to the stage now where we have the architecture being built up for our team. It's a heavy lift, living in deep space. So my prediction is, I would say 20 to 25 years. I would say in the 2040s. That's what we're thinking of, at least a human around Mars and hopefully on the surface. Yeah, that's my...
Well, thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Jason. Thank you all very much.
Yeah.